I wanted to bring today's episode to the podcast talking about fatigue and why this matters if you're trying to conceive. You may be feeling low energy levels, or maybe you're just exhausted all the time and you've been feeling like that way for years. We're talking about fatigue and really doing a deep dive into this, taking a functional approach. Even if you've been told, this is all in your head and you think you should be able to increase your energy levels and nothing is working, really digging into why this is happening in the first place and how this is potentially linked to your fertility diagnosis. Definitely, if you are feeling exhausted, tired, fatigued, this episode is for you. I regularly speak with 5 to 10 couples per week who are struggling to have their baby. And although we want to help everyone, we only have 4 spots available per month to work with us. I would like to invite you and your partner to a Supercharge Your Fertility Discovery Call. And this call is for you if you meet at least one of these criteria. You've been trying to get pregnant for at least 2 years. You've been through at least one failed IUI or IVF. This calls for action takers. If you're not ready and you wait, the risk is you'll need to wait 2 to 3 months for a spot to open up. If you're seriously considering working with us, go to FabFertile, F-A-B Fertile, and click on Book a Free Call. That's FabFertile, F-A-B Fertile, and click on Book a Free Call. Then you'll be all booked in and ready to spend 30 minutes to give you the action plan to getting pregnant naturally. One theme that keeps coming up with the couples in our FabFertile Couples Coaching Program is sleep. Whether it's insomnia, having a hard time falling asleep, waking up at night, or feeling tired when we wake up, sleep is critical for fertility and hormones. And that's why I'm so excited to have Blue Blocks as our podcast sponsor. So we're exposed to blue and green light from our phones, our tablets, our computers, indoor lights, and more. And this exposure impacts our melatonin production. And melatonin is essential for both female and male fertility. It helps determine the frequency and duration of our cycle and impacts sperm. There's lots of blue light blocking glasses on the market, but the ones from Blue Blocks, they've actually compared other popular brands, and Blue Blocks block 100% of blue and green light while other brands fall short. So I have their sleep glasses. They have red lenses, and the ones I have are a little translucent frame, and they're so stylish and really cool. And so they eliminate 100% of the blue and green light in the 400 nanometer to 550 nanometer range. So this is exact range that has been shown in clinical studies to disrupt melatonin and negatively impact your sleep. So all you do is wear your sleep glasses after sunset until it's time for bed, and you'll notice improved sleep after just one use. And it's also cool to use when you're flying for managing jet lag. So I got to say, I was a little skeptical about the noticing improvement after one use, but literally I use these glasses and my sleep is actually already pretty good. I used them for one day, and I have to say, after one day, I had the best sleep of my life. I just felt so rested. So these glasses, they ship free and they're tracked for all orders anywhere in the world. And also they have all their frames come in prescription, non-prescription, and reading glasses. Plus you can send in your frames and they'll add the blue light blocking and green light blocking lenses to your frame. So this is an easy hack that you can add to your fertility toolkit. All you do is go to BlueBlocks, BLUBLOX.com. Use the coupon code GetPregnantPodcast at checkout and receive a 15% discount. That's BlueBlocks, BLUBLOX.com, and use the coupon code GetPregnantPodcast to receive your 15% discount. Hey there. Thanks so much for listening to the Get Pregnant Naturally podcast. And I've got a favor to ask you. If you are enjoying learning about the functional approach to fertility, consider going to iTunes and rating and reviewing the podcast. This is how it helps the show reach more people that are struggling with infertility, knowing that there's another approach that really can get to the bottom of why it's not working in the first place. So all you need to do is, if you're on the app or the desktop, just go in and consider leaving a 5-star rating and leave a review. And there is step-by-step instructions in the show notes showing you exactly how to do that. So if you can just take a few minutes, just take the few minutes right now. You can pause this recording, come back, leave the review. It would really mean the world to me and help others that are on the fertility journey as well. Take care. I didn't need to go to donor eggs. Obviously, I don't regret it. I have beautiful children. I could have done things differently, restored. I was still cycling back in my 20s. I could have looked at my health, the environmental toxins, the stress I was under.
Many women are being told their eggs are too old. That's often merely an assumption that's not based on actual evidence. The reason being that there is no direct test of egg quality. You can't test egg quality.
It's the man who's got a food sensitivity or he has a zinc deficiency.
Like there can be a root cause to these symptoms that are, quote unquote, period problems, that the doctor will pass you a pill without any question of why.
And some part of you knows that if you can reframe your journey from not want to struggle, or if it is struggle, learn how to embrace the struggle. Learn how to embrace it.
Most conditions in the child occur during the 9 months of development. It's the genetic switches are turned on or turned off, and they're pre-programmed. So you are in such a powerful, amazing position to do amazing things for your kids.
Why is IVF the first step? Because we believe it should be the last step. Welcome to Get Pregnant Naturally, where functional medicine and natural fertility solutions will help you get pregnant and have your baby. Hey there, I'm Sarah Clark, founder of Fab Fertile and your host. I believe the functional approach is the first step for anyone struggling with infertility, and my aim is to help you get pregnant naturally. Today, I'm welcoming Dr. Evan Hirsch to the podcast, and we're digging into why optimizing energy levels and addressing fatigue is essential when you're on the trying to conceive journey. Dr. Evan Hirsch is a world-renowned fatigue expert and is the founder and CEO of the International Center for Fatigue. Through his best-selling book, podcasts, and online programs, he has helped thousands of people around the world optimize their energy naturally. He is on a mission to help 1 million more. Thanks so much for listening. I'm so thankful that you're here. Make sure you hit subscribe. And if you know someone else who is on the fertility journey, please share this podcast with them. Hey, Dr. Evan, excited to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on, Sarah.
Awesome. Yeah. Can you share your journey of really how you came to do this work?
Absolutely. So for me, so many people you hear about, they had a personal struggle. And what was interesting is that it happened to me twice. They say lightning doesn't strike in the same spot twice, but unfortunately it did for me. And so becoming a fatigue expert for me, I had come out of medical school and started residency, and I met my wife. We fell in love, and 3 months later, she couldn't get out of bed. So that was my first experience. And it took her 3 years to get over it. She did a lot of personal development work and saunas and adrenal work and coffee enemas and a bunch of other things that were really supportive for her. Then a couple of years later, after I had graduated residency, started my own functional medicine practice, had a child, got married, not necessarily all in that order. A couple of years later, ended up with my own fatigue that lasted for 5 years. And it just about destroyed my life, destroyed my relationships. My wife was just coming out of fatigue. We had this newborn baby, and I couldn't even do the dishes at home. I could barely work. I had to keep hiring other people to come into my practice. I had 4,000 square feet of office space and 10 employees, and had to just keep hiring people to continue to support what I was doing because I had to decrease my work hours less and less. Until finally, I was like, enough of this. And I started seeing practitioners, and I couldn't get the results that I wanted. And so I started going on my own. So at this point, I was already well-versed in functional medicine, very focused on healing the gut and replacing deficiencies. But what I didn't know was about environmental toxicity. So heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, negative emotional patterns, all those things, electromagnetic frequencies, toxicity, and all those things were things that I had to learn because I had all of them. And so as I went through this process and I found all the causes, because I knew if I found all the causes of fatigue, I could eventually get over it. And that's exactly what happened. With every cause that I found, I fixed it. I got a little bit better until eventually I have the great energy that I have today.
Yeah. And I think we were chatting just briefly beforehand. Many people think as they get older, they're destined to be exhausted and, having an afternoon slump, and really your energy just declines as you go into your 30s, 40s. And, obviously we're helping couples that are trying to conceive. So why is it important to address energy levels for someone who is trying to conceive?
Yeah. And I should say, I just saw a 68-year-old who told me he feels better now than he did when he was 30. So it definitely has nothing to do with your age. So the reason why energy levels are so important for people to focus on when they're looking at conceiving is because if you are tired, it's indicating a larger problem. Fatigue is a harbinger of, what's to come, as well as being able to show you that there's other problems that are present. So what I I found is that there's 10 different causes of fatigue that can be broken up into deficiencies and toxicities, and we'll get more into these in a little bit. But all of those causes of fatigue are also what I found to be, and I'm not a conception specialist, but what I have found in my limited experience to be, for those people who have a hard time getting pregnant, it's because of all these toxicities and these deficiencies that they have that puts the body into a stressful, chronic stressful situation. And once you fix all that stuff, then the body's just a lot happier and it's so much easier to conceive.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's sort of, if the body's under attack, it wants to survive, not procreate. It kind of just pushes it down. Yeah. Not prioritizing that. So how do we know if we have fatigue? Sometimes, is it that afternoon slump? Is it that we're, dark circles and we're dragging our butt? Like what are the symptoms? How do we know for sure?
So at its most basic form, it's really tiredness that's not relieved by rest. So if you're getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night and you're still tired during the day, where you're crashing multiple times a day, or you're surviving on caffeine, you can't survive without it, whether it's coffee or 5-hour energy or black tea or whatever, or you can't survive without a nap, then you know that there's a problem. And we're not talking about like how it was in college when we used to time went on weekends and then have to sleep longer, or whether we had a final exam and we would come home and we'd sleep for a couple of weeks, right? And then eventually we'd get back to baseline. But if you're given 7 to 9 hours of good sleep per night, you're still tired, you're waking up and you're tired, and it's been a couple of months, your body is crying out for help. You definitely need to go get assessed.
And so some of the symptoms, what can we look for? Is it just, they're just that feeling chronically tired, even after all the rest? Anything else that we'd see?
So that's a good question. So there are other symptoms that oftentimes can be present, but in terms of like fatigue and tiredness, sometimes there's a tiredness and sometimes there's like a bone tired feeling, or people can really tell the difference between fatigue and being tired. Some people can't, which is why, I call it tiredness. But oftentimes it will be accompanied by other symptoms like brain fog, like lightheadedness, or a dizziness that people get when they go from a sitting to a standing position. This is called orthostatic hypotension, where your blood pressure drops. And this is because the adrenals and other parts of the body are not able to maintain your blood pressure. Oftentimes you'll be craving sweet and salty foods. People will say they can't walk by a bag of potato chips without reaching in. And a lot of this just has to do with the dysfunction that ends up happening from the chronic stress, whether it's mental, emotional, or physical, like from these toxicities like heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, allergies, negative emotional patterns, like all these things that are crushing the body, causing the stress, and end up causing this fatigue and then other symptoms. And then we'll get into some more of these when we talk about infections, but you can have, any sort of weird symptom, pain on the feet, muscle pain, sleep problems, anxiety, depression. Like there are a number of different ones that kind of go along with it. It's rare when somebody just has fatigue. Oftentimes there are other symptoms as well.
It's interesting with the dizziness piece and the hypertension. So then getting up and then feeling dizzy, I see that with some of the clients we're working with too. We're experiencing that. So with fatigue and tiredness, this may be impacting libido and sex drive. And so how is testosterone levels, how are they impacting energy?
Yeah, let's first talk about kind of that schism or that difference, as you mentioned initially, around libido and survival. So there's a pathway that makes our sex hormones as well as our adrenal hormones, and the resources that are used for both of those hormones are the same. Start off with cholesterol, then go to pregnenolone, and finally get down into the progesterone and estrogen and testosterone on one side and the cortisol and whatnot on the other side. Now, what's interesting is that, and this is one of the reasons why people have low libido, is because your body's not going to want to procreate when it's in survival mode. So all those resources are going to be shifted over to the adrenals and to survival during times of chronic stress, whether it's, like I said, mental, emotional, or physical. And so then you're going to have a low libido. I love the example of the kangaroo. So the kangaroo, and this actually ties in nicely to conception, though humans don't do it this way, where the Australian kangaroo can actually cessate the growth of a fetus. So you have a fetus, it is growing, and during times of stress, the kangaroo will stop the growth of the fetus, which is really interesting and kind of goes along with this. You don't want procreation to happen when you're in a survival mode, okay? And then that chronic stress might be from not enough food or a predator or whatever it is, but then when that stressor is removed, then all of a sudden the fetus can kind of kick back on. So that kind of is a really nice example of that shift that has to happen. Now, how does testosterone play a role in this? So testosterone plays a large role. In fact, it's a huge role in libido. But what's important to remember remember is that there is a really beautiful dance that goes on between the adrenal gland, which is, for those of you who don't know, a little triangular gland that sits on top of the kidneys and produces a number of different hormones, the main one being cortisol, which is our main get up and go hormone that also regulates insulin and the immune system, blood sugars, energy, a number of different things, inflammation. And what's important about this is that you have the adrenals, you have the thyroid, and then you have the ovaries in women and testicles in men. And that forms a beautiful dance. It's like a three-legged table, and everybody's got to be present and accounted for to support everybody else in order for things to work properly. So if testosterone is not functioning correctly, you don't have enough production, your libido is low, oftentimes by boosting the adrenals, the thyroid, and also the mitochondria, which is the energy center of every cell in the body, those together I've found to be incredibly helpful for increasing libido so that you can, increasing testosterone so that people can have a good libido.
It's interesting because I just interviewed someone, Dr. Shauna Swan, for her new book, Countdown, talking about in the last 40 years, 50%, that there's been a 50% decline in sperm count, and then talking about the declining testosterone levels. What are you seeing with that?
Yeah, I would agree with it. But, what I see a lot is the toxicities and how the toxicities affect the hypothalamic pituitary oat system, the ovaries, adrenals, thyroid, or testicles, that whole relationship that has to happen. And the chronic stress that people are under from all of these toxicities is really common. One of the biggest ones that I see that a lot of people aren't talking about, or not enough people, is mold toxicity, where mold toxicity, especially in a young man, 20s, 30s, low libido, low testosterone, 9 times out of 10, it's mold toxicity.
And is that really where, if you've had any kind of leaks in your house, or like to dig deeper, right? Obviously, if there's water damage or leaks, to make sure, obviously it could be in your office too, like the whole mold remediation is its own beast. But I think you wanted to say briefly on mold.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we get more into like all those causes, we can talk about it as well. But yeah, mold is incredibly nebulous and hard to discern, and oftentimes people don't believe that they've actually had mold exposure. Some people are turning me off right now. They're like, I don't have any mold. But what they have to think about is that, have you ever lived in a building or worked in a building that had a water leak of some sort, whether it's flooding the basement? Well, actually, when I grew up in Indiana, there was a basement that flooded in our home every winter, right? Or maybe it was a busted pipe at some point, or maybe there were cats that peed on a bunch of cardboard boxes in the basement that I lived in when I was in medical school in Toledo, Ohio. Or maybe there was a leak in a roof, that you didn't realize you had. And then it gets into the walls, and then all of a sudden you have an issue. And most of the time you don't even see the mold. If you, if you see the mold behind the bed or whatever it is, that is the tip of the iceberg. The other 2/3 or 7/8 is actually behind the wall and throughout the house. So it's incredibly important to make sure that people get that evaluated.
We had in our bedroom where there was, the prior owner used to keep the window open. So it had leaked behind, and this is like only a 20-year-old house, but it had leaked behind the wall. And then my husband ripped the whole thing out in our bedroom and probably just blew mold all through us. Had like sinus issues and all this stuff. I'm like, oh my goodness. Anyway, we've moved from there now, but like he did wear a respirator at the time. But I've actually done a number of podcast episodes. So if anyone, the listener, wants to go and check some of those, you can just click on mold. But yeah, to get someone to properly do it, and definitely don't want to just rip it apart by yourself.
And also you made a good point about newer homes too. So a lot of people think, oh, I've got a new home, there's no chance. But unfortunately, if you're driving around town and it's raining, guess what? You're going to see any construction. You'll see those, the wood that's up there, it's all getting wet. And what happens is the first sunny day is that everybody congregates and they, slap on the outside and seal it up nice and tight. And guess what? Now you've got a wet and a warm environment, which is perfect for mold to grow. So, it doesn't matter whether the home is newer or older or whatever.
It's interesting because we're in a new construction site here, and we're in Canada, and they are building houses all year long. They don't stop for the snow. They just keep going. And I'm like, there's a guy on top of the roof in the middle of a blizzard. I thought he was going to fall off. And I'm like, okay, yeah, exactly. All these things have been wet, and now you're encasing it and they're trying to dry it off. And so So what about energy levels around the menstrual cycle? What's normal there? What are you seeing?
You really shouldn't have a dip if things are functioning correctly. The reason why people have PMS type symptoms or symptoms a week before they have their period is because of a dysregulation or an imbalance between the estrogen and progesterone. So if you were looking at this on a screen, I would show you that progesterone peaks in the second half of your cycle, and then estrogen also has a curve, but it's supposed to be less than progesterone. Now, what ends up happening is that estrogen is water soluble, which means it goes through the liver. Progesterone is fat soluble, which means it doesn't. There's a lot of things called xenoestrogens that we can potentially be consuming in our environments, whether it's from plastics or cosmetics or whatever, that increases the amount of estrogen. But what ends up happening is that people get more estrogen than they do progesterone during that last half or last part of their cycle. And unfortunately, when that happens, estrogen is pro-inflammatory, progesterone is anti-inflammatory. When you have more estrogen than progesterone, you end up getting inflammatory symptoms. So this can be cramping, this can be menstrual migraines, this can be sleep issues, a number of things. This can be decrease in energy. So anytime in the increase in sensitivity to foods, oftentimes people will be more responsive or have more problems with allergies at this time, because anytime you are more inflamed in your body, your immune system is more reactive to everything that you have in your body. So whether that's those toxicities, like I mentioned, heavy metals, chemicals, molds, or infections, or foods, or inhalants like weeds and grasses, you're just going to be more reactive, and consequently, you're going to feel worse.
Yeah, and the menstrual cycle is being a fifth vital sign to really, it should come and go and not be an event. If you've got pain or things like that, that's a clue to dig deeper. And obviously, if your energy levels are dipping, then that could be common but not normal. And so we see a lot of times, like 99% of the time, that there's something going on with the thyroid. Typically more hypothyroidism or subclinical thyroid issues. We see some Hashimoto's, some grays, but more Hashis. And so what's the connection there with the thyroid and fatigue, and why does that matter if someone's trying to conceive?
So when we're talking about these 10 different causes of fatigue, one of them is hormone deficiencies. And in those hormone deficiencies, you've got deficiencies in adrenals, thyroid, sex hormones. And so thyroid by itself plays a role. Now, what's interesting about fatigue is that everybody who has fatigue has multiple of these causes. So everybody's got, in these 10 causes that I'm mentioning, these 10 categories, everybody's got 8 to 10. So something from 8 to 10 of these categories. So it's this conglomeration of not having enough of stuff, so these deficiencies, and then having too much of stuff, which is these toxicities. Now, what's interesting is that the deficiencies, like deficiencies in hormones, are actually caused by the toxicities. So the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, and the infections, all of these can cause the thyroid issues. Now, thyroid really is two issues, right? It's an autoimmune condition where the immune system is attacking the thyroid, and then it's also a deficiency issue where you just don't have enough thyroid floating around in the body, right? And so that autoimmunity issue, or Hashimoto's, which is damaging the thyroid and then causing the resultant low thyroid, is actually being caused by those toxicities. So the heavy metals, chemicals, molds, or infections. I'm going to just keep saying those things because they're so important. I want to jam them into people's memories that they need to be thinking about it. But those toxicities are causing the immune system to be triggered to be attacking the thyroid. And the way that I see it and the way that I've learned is that they're actually in the thyroid. There's some different thinking around this where, maybe the heavy metals are in one part of the body, they're triggering the immune system, and then it's confused and it's attacking the thyroid. But what I believe and what I've learned is that a lot of these toxicities are actually inside the thyroid, and the immune system is just doing its job trying to get rid of these toxicities. It just so happens it has to go through the thyroid in order to get there, which is why it's breaking off of pieces of the thyroid, and it's just not able to get there, and consequently you end up with low thyroid.
Yeah, because it's subclinical, so it's not actually the thyroid issue. It's something else, as you say, all those different things that are going on that are causing the thyroid to go off. And then you talked about the adrenals. So the connection between the adrenals and fatigue, and that sort of grabbing for the chip bag and that dizziness when you wake up. So what's the connection there?
Yeah, so a lot of people think that they've coined this term adrenal fatigue, which isn't really a term. And once again, adrenals are just one of these 10 causes. Or actually, when you look at the subset of causes, when you're looking at these 10 categories, it's actually 33 different sub-causes where adrenals are one, thyroid is one, and so on, which we can get to in a little bit. And so with the adrenals, yep, exactly like you said, your lightheadedness, you're lightheaded on standing, you're having a hard time sleeping, you're crashing throughout the day, generally at around 10 or 11 a.m., but definitely at around like 2 to 4 p.m. That's like the major crash time. You're craving salty and sweet foods, got brain fog, your energy is low. There's a number of different things. So it's just one of those causes. Now, what I found too is that what I call the big three is the most important, like first step of this process, or actually it's the second step, but it's about boosting the adrenals, the thyroid, and the mitochondria, which is the energy center of every cell in the body. And that combination can really be transformative for folks because they work in synergy in order to really boost your energy.
And so let's talk about why it's so hard to treat fatigue. And I guess, can you talk about chronic fatigue syndrome and then fatigue? Are those different or?
They are indeed. So chronic fatigue syndrome is a diagnosis of exclusion where basically the doctor is not sure. There's no markers to determine whether or not somebody has it. Basically, if you've had a number of different symptoms for longer than 6 months, which include energy and body pain and sleep issues and a couple of other things. There was a new term that came out a couple of years ago by the Institute of Medicine, systemic exertion intolerance disease, or SEID, which is a little bit better where you're not able to tolerate exerting yourself. But what I'm really looking at is chronic fatigue, because the difference between chronic fatigue and chronic fatigue syndrome, or myalgic encephalitis, which is what they call it over in Europe and beyond. The difference is just about the number of causes that you have and the severity of those causes. So the difference is going to be, you've got 8 to 10 of those causes in chronic fatigue, but you may have 8 to 10 of those that are just with certain ones being more severe that ends up causing the chronic fatigue syndrome. And then to answer your other question, which is why it's so hard to treat, is because when you're looking at all of these causes, maybe now would be a good time to dive into those.
Yeah, go for it.
When you're looking at all of these causes, everybody has different causes. Everybody has different multiple causes. And so if you've got causes, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and somebody else has causes 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10, you're going to require very different treatments. So one of the reasons why it's hard to treat is because it's more than just one cause. People will get better going to their conventional, natural, functional medicine doctor, whoever, just by boosting their deficiencies that are things that are not in the body that are supposed to be. You're going to feel better. But if you're not addressing all of the causes, if you're not removing all of these nails that are in the bottom of the foot, right, then you're not going to be getting complete resolution. So that's the one thing. And then the other thing is that everybody's got different causes, and people are way too focused on looking for treatments instead of looking at their actual causes. So let's dive into it then. In terms of those 10 different categories of causes, we're looking at deficiencies and toxicities. Deficiencies being these things that are not in the body that are supposed to be. Toxicities are things that are in the body that aren't supposed to be there. So in the deficiencies, we're looking at deficiencies of hormones, which we've been talking about, adrenals, thyroid, sex hormones. We're talking about deficiencies and dysfunction in mitochondria, which produces about 70 to 80% of our energy and gets squashed by all things toxicity, unfortunately. We're looking at things like deficiencies in nutrients, so deficiencies in vitamins, deficiencies in minerals. We're looking at deficiencies in lifestyle habits. So this is not enough water, not enough sleep, not enough good food, not enough movement. Though it's important to remember that with movement, oftentimes a lot of people who have fatigue, if they exercise, and we're seeing this oftentimes with the COVID-19 virus and this pandemic, is that a lot of people actually have thrown themselves into long haulers, which is the consequence of getting COVID-19, because they were exercising too much. And that ends up being too much of a stressor on the body. So with movement, much like everything else, you have to find the right dose. You have to make sure if you are fatigued that you are not stressing your body too much by continuing to exercise. But those are the main, and then neurotransmitter deficiencies in serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, epinephrine. So those are the deficiencies. Now, what's important to remember is that the toxicities cause most of these deficiencies. Some of it's in genetic, about 20%, but 80% is environmental. So then going into the toxicities, we're looking at things like heavy metals. So for example, 100,000 pounds of mercury are dumped into our oceans every single year. 70% of all lipsticks have lead in them. Things like chemicals, 84,000 different chemicals we're exposed to on a regular basis, and most of those haven't been appropriately evaluated by the FDA and other governing bodies. Women are exposed to 580 different chemicals before they even leave the home in the morning. Molds, we just talked about those, but about half of all the buildings in first world countries have water damage, and most of those have mold. mold. You could have had exposure when you were 5 years of age, and then you didn't have a problem until you were 40 because it was a number of these toxicities that kind of built up over time. And that mold's going to stay in the body until you actually do something to get it out. And then we're looking at things like infections. The CDC, Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, came out a couple of years ago and said, actually, it's not 30,000 new cases of Lyme that people are experiencing per year in the United States. It's actually 300,000. And that doesn't include co-infections like Bartonella and Biscia and Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, Epstein-Barr virus. So viruses are a huge issue. And then there's bugs in the gut, whether it's parasites or yeast or other bacteria. So that's heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, allergies, whether it's to foods or inhalants, negative emotional patterns. So people listening, hopefully at this point, have heard about ACEs or adverse childhood events, but these can actually be adverse life events where anywhere along the line, whether it's significant trauma or whether it's trauma just to you that does not include abuse, but perhaps is anything less than nurturing, can trigger the body to be put into a chronic stressful response where it changes your relationship to yourself, to people around you, to the world. World's not a safe place, perhaps, and that ends up changing your life's trajectory and the stress, the mental and emotional stress that is then put on your human organism. So that's negative emotional patterning that needs to be looked at, oftentimes with something like nervous system retraining that we have in our programs, or limbic system retraining, and then electromagnetic fields or electromagnetic hypersensitivity syndrome, where there's all of these invisible rays that are affecting our body, damaging our DNA, increasing inflammation, and contributing to this toxic soup that I've just described. So I know that was a whole bunch of bad news, but take heart. Once you find out the causes that you have, you're going to be a lot more successful at removing these things out of your body.
Yeah, the root cause, dig in deeper. And a lot of times we just think we're tired and we've got to take, pharmaceuticals, or we're just doomed to have no energy for forever. And there's a cause and there's things we can do to heal. And if you're feeling that way and trying to conceive, it's improving the fatigue as well as getting pregnant, addressing all the toxicity, the heavy metals, the molds, the infections, like all these things. We do a similar thing, like looking at mental emotional stress with those. We have emotional freedom technique, which can help with that. And also therapy and the EMFs is interesting too. I've done a number of podcasts on that, talking about especially how it's impacting sperm quality and even, female reproductive health as well. We're putting our laptop on our lap and our phone to our ear, or our phone in our pocket, which is not good for the human body. And so anything you'd like to say then on those?
Well, I would say that, so in terms of the different causes, so we talked about why it's so hard to treat fatigue, and that's because everybody's got a different number of causes and they've got different causes than their neighbor, right? Which is why if Joe Schmo gets a B12 shot and feels great and their fatigue goes away, and Sally Sue gets a B12 shot and doesn't experience anything, the question is why? And it's just because you don't have that cause that individual does. The other thing that's important to remember is that if you do want complete resolution, you have to keep going. Because a lot of people are like, oh, I'm going to take something to boost these deficiencies and my energy gets better. But what they have to realize is that all of these causes of toxicity not only are causes of fatigue and conception issues, and it's also causes of Alzheimer's and heart attacks, heart disease, stroke, and cancer, right? So it's important that you get these things removed out of your body as an overall body reset, or overall, I don't want to say cleanse, but it's just good practice to make sure that you're getting all this crap out and you're making sure that you're no longer being exposed to it in your life. And it can feel overwhelming, but you just start off, you work with Sarah and you do these baby steps where you're just removing these different components every single month. So it's very possible. You just have to be scientific about it. Make sure that you find your causes so that your treatments can be specific to what you have.
And so for the patients that you're working with, is there a theme where you're like, wait a minute, I see a lot. I know on your website you talk about Bartonella with the infections. Is there some overarching theme? Is it mental emotional stress? Like, what do you see with your patients if there is a theme?
Well, because it's always this different combination, but everybody has adrenal and mitochondrial dysfunction, without a doubt. And then the question around the toxicity is everybody's got an infection and everybody's got multiple infections. And so the question is which infections? Because the thing is if you have heavy metals, chemicals, or molds, those all take the immune system, hijack it, and put it off into left field. And then the bugs become opportunistic. Because a lot of these bugs, we're 90% bug cells, 10% human cells. A lot of these bugs are living in our bodies with an imbalance until something happens, until you get a number of stressful hits, right? People will say, oh, I was fine until that day 2 years ago. And the reality is that was the straw that broke the camel's back. But in reality, you had mold exposure when you were 5, mercury fillings throughout your life, and then a divorce in the family, and then went to college and were stressed out by getting your master's, and then relationship breakup, and then all of a sudden you had a car accident, and that threw everything into a tizzy. And so you're like, it was all because of the car accident, when in reality, it was that buildup of all that toxicity over time.
And it's like, yeah, that tipping point where at that point the body's like, no more. And then the ones you're working with are fatigue. Obviously, I'm working with fertility, and it is interesting. Yeah, like we see the infections a lot, obviously, and then the mental emotional stress. And I think with the allergies, do you want to talk a little bit more about that? Are you seeing a lot of food sensitivities? Is that where you're?
Absolutely. And I should say that you were right. Mental emotional is also a huge part of this too. And the thing is that, when I had fatigue, I had a happy childhood, no quote unquote abuse that I saw, but I had a number of situations where I was rejected by peer groups and felt insecure, and changed the way that I was looking at life as a safe place. And so it's always part of this. And so people, when they go down this journey, they have to realize that if they want to get better, even if they're 100% or their energy is great, if you want to be a better human, you got to work on your emotional health. And so no matter how you're doing it, whether it's with our mindset practice that we teach in our program, or whether it's working with somebody who's going to retrain your nervous system or limbic system, it's a really important part of this process.
Could you talk a little bit about your process there that you do for the negative emotions training? What exactly do you do there?
So in terms of the mindset practice, what I've learned in the last several years is I looked at, a number of my mentors have taught me this in a number of different ways. But what I found is that putting together a number of different practices as a daily mindset practice has been incredibly helpful. So the first step is gratitudes. So there's really great research on just 3 gratitudes per day, decrease anxiety and stress by about 60%, and rewires the brain for starting to look for more things that you're grateful for in life. And those can be the same 3 things every day. Generally, I'm saying, thank you that my wife and my child are happy and healthy, and thank you for my job, and I'm able to provide for my family and help as many people as I can. And then I kind of expand on from there, helping, thank you for the rest of my family being well, and blah, blah, whatever it is. So it can be the same 3 every day, but that's an important part of the practice. And then the next thing is to have a vision. You have to have a vision of what you want your life to look like, whether this is next year, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. You want to look at your perfect day. And so I take people through a practice of walking through what their perfect day looks like. When you wake up, who are you next to? Where do you live? What does your day look like? What is your job that you have? What is your income? All those different things that you would think about as being part of your life, looking at personal and professional and whatnot, spiritual, emotional. And then we go into looking at limiting beliefs and empowering beliefs. And this can change from day to day. Sometimes I wake up and I've got a limiting belief of, oh gosh, my bank account is low, and then that stresses me out. Is there, scarcity of money? Why, there's not enough money? And you have to flip that on its head and look at the opposite, which is there's always enough money. I've never had a problem with money. Money is flowing through to me. And this is that wiring that we want to do, that neuroplasticity that changes the brain. And some people would say that it's, you're just faking it, or you fake it till you make it sort of thing. But the science is real, where, they did a Harvard study of 2 people who were pianists. They played the piano. One person sat down and practiced. The other person practiced in their mind. And then they put on a performance. And the only difference between the 2 of them was muscle memory, right? The person who just practiced in their mind lagged a little bit. But it goes to show the body doesn't know the difference between imagination and reality. So when you're watching those stressful horror films at night after dinner, and then you can't sleep, it's because your body was experiencing those things as if you were there, right? So it's just such an important part of this. And so we look at all the limiting beliefs: not enough time, not enough money, I'm not good enough, whatever it is that's coming up for folks. We flip it on its head And instead, we say these empowering beliefs, because those beliefs really are decisions and decisions that you're making in your life. And then the last part of the process is about empowering questions. And so if you think about it, there's a question that you are asking yourself on a regular basis. Why is this always happening to me? And it's usually not an empowering question. It's usually a disempowering question. Why am I so tired? Or why can't I figure this out? Or why is nobody helping me? Or whatever it is. And you want to flip that on its head as well and come up with the empowering question. And so, how can I love my family even more today? And we stick in even more because it assumes that it's already happening. It's a little brain trick. But how can I, what is one thing that I can do to move my business forward today, or to move my health forward? How can I be more grateful for my family even more today? Whatever it is. But those things are going to help reprogram the brain, and they help as part of that negative emotional patterning that we work on in order to bring people to another level and decrease their chronic mental and emotional stress, make them more grateful in their lives, in addition to also working on the physical stuff.
Love that. Gratitude, vision, limiting beliefs, and empowering questions. And I like that even more piece is really good. And then as far as, bioidenticals, we've done a few episodes on this. So it's basically kind of a Band-Aid approach. It's not our first step, but we can include bioidenticals, sometimes, as long as we're working on all the other things as well. What's your take with bioidenticals and fatigue, and what are you seeing?
Right now, I practice I'm an MD, but I practice as a health coach so that I can practice across state lines, and a third of our clientele are international. In order to be able to do that, I practice as a health coach, which means I don't prescribe anymore. But when I did, I used bioidenticals quite a bit, but I used it mainly for people who were menopausal or andropausal, where they needed estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone for some reason. Now, I don't know whether or not you're including adrenal and thyroid support as bioidenticals as well, like whether it's a hydrocortisone or whether it's thyroid hormone.
More of the progesterone and the estrogen. Yeah, not
okay,
the
more of the
thyroid.
sex hormones. Yeah. And I have found there's a lot of natural things that I use that they'll either increase the production naturally in the body of estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, or they're just going to be natural forms of those different compounds. But I have found that when I boost the adrenals and the thyroid, it is rare when I actually need to include sex hormones. When you're treating fatigue in the work that you're doing as well, when you're dealing with so many different causes that have to be addressed, you've got to figure out what the biggest bang is for the buck. And what I've found is that it's really not the bioidentical hormone. I loved them, and, women would be so happy because, you fix their hormones and whatnot. And sometimes, depending on how menopausal they are, how many years they've been in menopause, they really need those bioidenticals. But when people are not in that situation, I don't use them. I find that when you're boosting adrenals and thyroid, you naturally are going to boost the sex hormones more. And I haven't found the need to use them.
And then what about autoimmune disease and fatigue? What are you seeing there?
So what's really interesting is that the causes of autoimmunity, and it's funny that you asked, because right now I'm doing an event with Dr. Tom O'Brien, who wrote the Autoimmune Fix, and it's going to be coming out in June. And we're doing a workshop on hidden causes, the fatigue and autoimmunity workshop, where we're going to be taking people, there are going to be lectures and speakers, but we're also going to be having a Facebook group, and we're going to have every single day, we're going to be in there, we're going to be taking people through practice of figuring out the causes that they have just based off their symptoms. Because, little aside, all those 33 different sub-causes that I talked about, 75% of those can be determined by your symptoms alone. So you can go through this process, and without any labs, you can already figure out 75% of your causes. Now, what's interesting, coming back to the question that you asked me, is that the causes of autoimmunity are very similar to the causes of fatigue. It's the deficiencies, but mainly it's the toxicities, the heavy metals, the chemicals, the molds, the infections, the allergies, the negative emotional patterns, and the electromagnetic fields.
And let's go back to the allergy question. What are you seeing there?
So if you picture the human body as a barrel, and over time, and the longer that you live in this life, the more crap gets dumped into it. The heavy metals, chemicals, molds, infections, allergies, blah, 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 until eventually it overflows. Now, what ends up happening when it overflows is when the immune system can no longer tolerate, when the liver can no longer tolerate, when the nervous system can no longer tolerate all these toxicities, and they become triggered. So it's very common when someone says, I've got all these allergies, and then we get rid of their toxicities, and all of a sudden they have have a lot less or no allergies anymore. And it's just because of the total body burden. The research is clear on if you have a grass allergy and you have a dairy allergy and you're eating dairy, you're going to be more reactive to grass. It's just a total body burden of the number of things that the immune system is reacting to. And the more reactive the immune system is, the more reactive it's going to be to anything else that you put on top of that immune system.
Yeah, I had the same thing so I was diagnosed with premature ovarian failure at 28. I had both my kids with donor eggs. And then years later, then I had all these food sensitivities. I remember started getting seasonal allergies and I couldn't walk by a cat without getting hives. And then I remember doing a food sensitivity test and every last thing I was eating came back lit up. And so as I worked on the gut and, worked on the toxicities and things like that, now there's still foods that I keep out. So dairy, gluten, and corn, but I can eat other foods. And it is, sometimes it's a snapshot in time. And as we start to heal all those other issues, and then now I don't have the seasonal allergies. And I'm not that I'm petting a cat for hours, but I can be around a cat and not start wheezing and having to leave the room. So it's interesting as you start to heal those things, how those things miraculously go again. I don't need to, down a box of Claritin all the time. And what about chronic infections? You talked about this before. Anything else? Any final thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite things to talk about because as I mentioned, so many people that I see have chronic infections and usually multiple chronic infections. And really the more severe folks have combinations of some of these infections. So what I call Bartonella, which is like a combination of Borrelia, which is also known as Lyme, Biscia, and Bartonella. And so it seems like a number of these things that we're seeing is that these infections actually will swap DNA with each other when they're hiding in the biofilm, which is kind of like this collagenous material that bugs can hide under and swap their DNA with each other, creating some of these superbugs, which makes them even harder to treat. But in isolation, you can learn a lot about which bug you have just based off of your symptoms. So this is a very important moment in this talk for everybody to listen up if they do have fatigue or any sort of weird symptoms that they have. So you really can't have Borrelia or Lyme if you don't have the following. You have to have symptoms that move around the body, okay? And that can be symptoms of joint pain, muscle pain, or nerve pain, like shooting pains or numbness and tingling or whatever. They move around the body where one day it's going to be, let's say pain in the left shoulder. And then the next day or the next week or the next month, that pain has now moved to the right knee. The other symptom that you have to have is you have to have symptoms that come and go, where some days are better than others. And oftentimes a consequence of this is that you don't feel comfortable scheduling things because you don't know what kind of day you're going to have. So if you don't have those two things, you really can't have Borrelia. And then in terms of Bartonella, which upwards of 50% of all domestic animals actually have Bartonella colonized. In fact, it's in its acute form, or when somebody gets scratched by a cat and they get Bartonellosis, acute Bartonellosis, then they get big lymph nodes and they get a fever, and it's called cat scratch fever. But what we're talking about more is like chronic Bartonellosis, which is basically these symptoms that include pain on the bottom of the feet, or in the feet, usually misdiagnosed as plantar fasciitis, if you've ever received that diagnosis.
That's an interesting one. Just to interrupt you there. So it's interesting. A number of clients, all of a sudden, everyone keeps talking to me about plantar fasciitis, like they were all experiencing it.
But oftentimes they'll have pain on the bottom of the feet. Sometimes it's burning. Sometimes it's just uncomfortable when you get out of bed and you want to put on your slippers to walk around the house. Oftentimes there's cramping, whether it's muscle cramping, usually in the calves, usually at night. Sometimes it'll go away with water or banana or potassium or magnesium. But even if it goes away with that, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have Bartonella. And then there's rashes that can show up where it looks like a scratch. There's, the only way that I've ever been able to take people off of their thyroid medicine is actually when people have had Bartonella and they have thyroid issues, and I treat them for Bartonella, and I've been able to wean them off of their thyroid medication to an appreciable degree. And then oftentimes people are having hard time sleeping, either falling asleep or staying asleep. They're having anxiety or depression. They'll have body pain, usually misdiagnosed as fibromyalgia. And oftentimes they'll have headaches, usually from the muscle pain. Sometimes they'll have migraines. but those are a lot of the symptoms that people will get. You don't have to have all of them. If you had like the plantar fasciitis and a hard time sleeping and maybe a little bit of anxiety, that could be enough to determine whether or not somebody has Bartonella. And I do have a Bartonella quiz on my website for anybody who's interested.
Yeah, definitely check out that quiz on your website, and that's at
fixyourfatigue.com. That's right. And I can keep going. 2 more bugs left. So Biscia is another bug that we find to be quite common, and it is considered the North American malaria. It gets inside the cell and it'll make people feel hot. And so what's interesting, and I know that your population probably isn't like this, but if you're postmenopausal or you're perimenopausal and you're trying to figure out what's a hot flash versus Biscia, sometimes that could be a little bit confusing. But oftentimes, this heat will be cyclical, where sometimes you're getting some night sweats every week, every month, every couple months. Oftentimes, you're the hottest person in the room. So you may find that, when somebody's outside shoveling snow in their short sleeves, sometimes it's because they're such a heater, and that's because they're feeling warm. Oftentimes, people also have some sort of lung issue, whether it's a cough or a shortness of breath. And then they'll have usually really bad sleep to the point of sometimes people are like, I didn't sleep at all last night. They'll have anxiety to the point of panic attacks and depression to the point of suicidal thoughts. So once again, you don't have to have all those symptoms. You can just have a couple of them. And Biscia can be a major problem for these individuals. And then, like I said, a lot of times there's multiple infections present. So sometimes people are going to have a number of these. Biscia and Bartonella oftentimes like to travel in teams, unfortunately. And then there's some of the viruses like Epstein-Barr virus, sore throat, large lymph nodes, general malaise and fatigue. All these will cause fatigue as well. And then other viruses, like now we've got the COVID-19. Interestingly about COVID-19 and long haulers, we're basically, I'm not entirely sure whether or not COVID-19 is causing these symptoms, all these weird symptoms on its own. But if you just heard that list that I just mentioned for Borrelia, Bartonella, Biscia, Epstein-Barr virus, COVID-19 long haulers sounds a lot like that. And so what we're seeing is that sometimes it's unmasked, or it's been a biofilm disruptor where it's broken up the hiding places of some of these other infections, so that some of these weird symptoms that we're getting are due to now Biscia and Bartonella that people didn't have before, but all of a sudden the immune system's not working right and whatever, trying to deal with the COVID. And now we have other infections that are present, which weren't present before.
Yeah, many times we're, chasing around these symptoms for years, going to doctor and being told that, oh no, it's all in your head. And meanwhile, you've got an infection like that. And typically these things are not in your head. And if there's something going on, it is to really, get a professional and to like yourself and to really dig deeper with this. And yeah, because it, impacts your whole life. You think there's something, maybe you should just snap out of it and you should be fine. That's not the case.
Absolutely. Yeah. Nobody really likes to go to the doctor, right? People who, they're like, oh, this person's a hypochondriac, or, there's nothing wrong with you. Like, if you don't feel right, there is something wrong with you, right? And you need to figure out what it is. It might be mental, emotional, or physical. And what's really interesting is that there are studies to show that people with schizophrenia, for example, who were put on antibiotics, they did a study on these people who were put on doxycycline for a month, and they saw a 60% reduction in their schizophrenic symptoms. Like, there's a huge component of mental health in these infections and how these infections affect our neurotransmitters. And so we can't ignore them, and we have to make sure that we're looking at all possible causes.
And so you have got a free PDF download of your #1 best-selling book, Fix Your Fatigue. So the 4-step process to resolving chronic fatigue, achieving abundant energy, and reclaiming your life. And I'll have that in the show notes, but it's gofixyourfatigue.org, full book PDF opt-in. But I'll have the link in the show notes. Anything you wanted to share they can expect in that?
So yeah, that's, my editor called that my life's work, because I put my heart and soul into that book, just trying to get the word out, because I am on a mission to help 1 million people resolve their fatigue. And if you read it and you like that approach and you want to go deeper and you want support, definitely reach out to us. We'll be happy to do that.
Excellent. Any final thoughts on fatigue?
I think what's really important to remember is don't ever give up hope. And keep moving in a positive direction. If you've got that mindset on right, you're going to work your way out of any limiting beliefs you have, and finding a mentor, like Sarah or myself, to, somebody who's fixed a problem that you have. You want to make sure that if they fixed it for themselves, they fixed it for other people. You want to make sure you're following somebody who can actually get you where you want to go. You want to make sure that they've got the testimonials to back it up. And you have to realize that you're also potentially going to kiss a lot of frogs along the way before you meet your prince. Like oftentimes you see a practitioner and you learn one new thing and that helps you. And then you see another practitioner and you learn another new thing. But in reality, if you can find all of those causes, then you can like skip the line and go directly to kissing your prince per se. But you want to make sure that your practitioner is addressing all those causes. So make sure when you talk to them that you're asking them, are you addressing all of these causes? How do you address them? How many people have you treated with this? Do you have any testimonials that I can see of people who have dealt with these issues that have gotten over it?
Yeah, so you don't waste time and money, and really you can fast track your success. Exactly. Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your words of wisdom on this topic. It's fascinating with all this. So thank you so much for all the work that you're doing, Dr. Evan.
Likewise. Thanks for having me on.
I regularly speak with 5 to 10 couples per week who are struggling to have their baby. And although we want to help everyone, we only have 4 spots available per month to work with us. I would like to invite you and your partner to a Supercharge Your Fertility Discovery Call. And this call is for you if you meet at least one of these criteria. You've been trying to get pregnant for at least 2 years. You've been through at least one failed IUI or IVF. This calls for action takers. If you're not ready and you wait, the risk is you'll need to wait 2 to 3 months for a spot to open up. If you're seriously considering working with us, go to FabFertile, F-A-B Fertile, and click on Book a Free Call. That's FabFertile, F-A-B Fertile, and click on Book a Free Call. Then you'll be all booked in and ready to spend 30 minutes to give you the action plan to getting pregnant naturally. Melatonin is important for female fertility. It helps regulate hormones and maintain the body's circadian rhythms. Plus, it helps determine the frequency and duration of the menstrual cycle. Plus, it impacts sperm count and motility. Blue and green light negatively impact our melatonin production. That's why we recommend Blue Blocks, blue and green light sleep glasses to all our one-to-one clients. Simply go to BlueBlocks, BLUBLOX.com and use the coupon code GetPregnantPodcast at checkout to receive your 15% discount. That's BlueBlocks, BLUBLOX.com, and use the coupon code GetPregnantPodcast. The Get Pregnant Naturally podcast, including show notes and links, provides information with respect to healthy living, nutrition, lab testing, and is intended for informational purposes only. The information provided is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, nor is it to be construed as such. We cannot guarantee that the information provided on the Get Pregnant Naturally podcast reflects the most up-to-date medical research. Information is provided without representation or warranties of any kind. Please consult a qualified physician for medical advice and always seek the advice of a qualified healthcare provider with any questions you may have regarding your health and nutrition program.